Alrighty, so in this video, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at actually using React and JSX. So I'm going to be introducing a lot of concepts, and we're going to start off really slow. The example that we're going to put together over this video and maybe a couple others is going to be very, very simple, very trivial. And then we're going to move up to a slightly more complicated example. So now we have everything in place. The first thing I want to do is over on the left-hand side, I actually want to instruct Babel to compile this JavaScript file. So as of right now, Babel doesn't know to compile this file. We have Babel being added into our browser, but it's not going to process this file and do any sort of transformations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and instruct Babel to process this file by doing type equals text dash Babel. And this is the sort of syntax, the thing, by including the Babel's browser.js and adding type equals text Babel. We are having Babel transpile this on the fly for us, right? This is not an optimal production solution. It's not even an optimal development solution. This is something we use for playing around with ideas, playgrounds, demonstrations, presentations, stuff like that. When we move into building our big application in this series, we are going to see a proper development workflow and a proper production workflow with using Babel. But this is the simplest way to do it without any other setup. So by hitting Control S now Babel's actually going to process this file. So you shouldn't see any difference yet. If I come over here and refresh, you should still see the alert dialog being presented, but nothing else will change. And that's because we're not using any Babel features in our JavaScript file, but that's okay. We will be here shortly. So what I'm going to do is we are going to create a React application. And we're going to start off by creating a component. So like I said in a couple videos ago, React is all about components. The component hierarchy, which closely will mirror the DOM, the physical DOM in the browser. But components are where we add in our own features and our own view code, our own maybe sometimes controller code, and so on. And it's how we hook into React. And there's two ways. Actually, there's three ways to make a component. Well, I'm going to cover one of them in this video, and then in the next example, we'll see another way to do it. And the third way I'm not going to discuss. Well, I will discuss, but I'm not going to show you guys. And that is using the react.create class. If you've seen React code before, maybe older React code that's been around for a couple years, you would see that people use react.create class, something like that. You might have seen something like this somewhere along the lines of whatever you've been looking at, and we're not going to do it that way. We are going to be using the proper way, the way that the authors of React now recommend everybody do. And it has subtle differences between doing it the way I'm going to show you and using react.create class. If you've never used React before, don't worry about the create class syntax. If you have seen React code, I will be pointing out the differences between react.create class and this syntax. And what this syntax is it's simply going to take advantage of the ES 2015 class syntax. We're simply going to do class followed by, let's do like app component. It can be named whatever you want, but it can be named whatever you want. Make sure it starts with an uppercase. We'll get to why that matters here shortly. And we'll say class app component extends react.component. So React, again, is that global object that's added by this file right here. And React contains, the React global object contains all the core React functionality, and the react.component class is what we're going to be extending. So if you're not so familiar with this class syntax, I again have the series Using Modern JavaScript today that covers how to use it. And even though we are using the class syntax behind the scenes, it still is using prototypal inheritance. If you're not familiar with prototypal inheritance, I did a course that covered it called So You Think You Know JavaScript. So check those out if you are not comfortable with prototypal inheritance or the ES 2015 class syntax. But basically, we have this class. You can think of it more or less like a traditional object-oriented class in more traditional languages. And the only obligation that a component has, so again, a component is how we interact with React, how we hook into the library, how we tell it what we want to render, where, and when. And the only obligation of a React component that we make, a custom React component, is that we provide a method called render. And now what render does is render will return the shadow DOM that we want to represent on the physical DOM. So we talked about shadow DOMs and physical DOM in the previous couple videos ago, where we talked about how we had the shadow DOM, which is just a hierarchy of objects, just a normal hierarchy of normal JSON objects. And that's what render wants us to return. Render does not want us to return a jQuery object. It does not want us to return a document.create element. It does not want us to return that. That won't do anything. It'll probably throw an error, actually. It wants us to return a shadow DOM. So how do we create the shadow DOM? Well, the shadow DOM really is just a hierarchy of normal JavaScript objects. But React provides nice little helper methods to construct the shadow DOM for us. And so let's go ahead and take a look at that real fast. I'm going to throw in a really, really simple example here, and we'll expand it later. And we're not going to use JSX quite yet. Now, JSX is the special syntax that is React-specific, created by Facebook, and it's not a JavaScript standard. I'm going to show you guys what the JavaScript standard code would look like, and then we'll see what JSX looks like, and we'll be able to compare and contrast. So what we're going to return is simply react.createElement. I'm going to return react.createElement, and let's start off with passing in the type of element we want. What do we want? We want an H1. Then we pass in a list of attributes we want the element to have. So let's do class name is header, which is kind of redundant because it's an H1, but bear with me. And then we're going to pass in the content. The content will simply be hello world. So this is how, well, actually, this is not how we create the shadow DOM, because we'll be seeing, we're building up to how we'll actually create this shadow DOM soon. But this is how the shadow DOM is created behind the scenes. We use the react.createElement syntax. We pass in the element type that we want. Then we pass in a list of attributes. Now notice something interesting about these attributes. I'm using class name. I'm not using class. Now, first of all, JavaScript might be a little bit mad about me using class as a property name because it's a reserved word, but even if I put it in quotes, that won't work. The reason it won't work is because what you have to understand about the shadow DOM is the properties you set on the shadow DOM are not like the properties you set on elements. See, if I have an element and I wanted to add a class to it, I would do class equals bleh, right? But if I had a DOM element like const el equals document create element h1, if I wanted to set the class of this, I would do el.className equals and then whatever. You would not do el.class equals bleh. You would use the class name property. So it's important to understand that the properties we pass in here are the JavaScript property names of a DOM element, not necessarily the names that we use over here. So anyway, so we've created a simple component that renders out a simple H1 element to the shadow DOM, but it doesn't do anything yet. I mean, creating a class doesn't do anything. Creating a function doesn't do anything. We have to be able to call it. We have to hook it into React. We have to tell React, hey, I want this app component, and I want it mounted to this application element. I want to take this, I want to instantiate it, create an instance of it, and I want to slap it on that application element. So to do that, we use the React DOM, which is the second JavaScript file we included. So to render it out to the DOM, we simply do react.DOM.render. Now render takes in two parameters. The first parameter is a shadow DOM, basically. So we're going to do react.createElement, but instead of passing in react.createElement h1, which would work, by the way, instead of doing that, though, we're going to pass an app component as a non-quoted thing. We're actually passing in a reference to this class, and behind the scenes, the class, of course, turns into a function. We're passing a function straight into createElement. And then we're going to pass in null for the properties, because we're not passing any properties into the app component. The second parameter of react.DOM.render is going to be, not surprisingly, come on, get element. I always mix up, I don't know why, I always want to say find element by ID, but anyway, get element by ID application. So the second parameter is where we want that component to go. So the first thing is we pass in the shadow DOM into React Render. The second thing is where we want it to get mounted to. And now if I come over here, we see example 1, hello world. So again, just to recap this example, we have a component. A component class's only responsibility is to provide a render method, although it can do a whole lot more, which we'll be seeing in this example and additional examples. And the render method returns an instance of the shadow DOM, and we use the react.createElement helpers in order to construct the JavaScript objects that React understands. So I'm really trying to drive home the point that these objects are just normal JSON objects. They're normal, straight up JavaScript objects. They're not special. They're not elements. They're not anything magical. They're just a string of object hierarchy that contains different things. And the react.createElement method creates that thing for us, that representation for us. And then we do react.DOM.render. We pass in the shadow DOM. Again, this react.createElement app component is creating a component, mounting a component, but we're not restricted to that. I could say React, like I said before, I could say React create element, and I could put an h2 null for the properties and say whoa, and this would work as well. If I come over here, we'll notice that now he says whoa. So you can see we can mount any sort of shadow DOM you want with the react.DOM.render. By mounting a component, that component then gets hooked into this element, and then React behind the scenes invokes the render method of that component, and then whatever shadow DOM returned by that render method then gets rendered out into the actual DOM. So let's go ahead and take a look at what the DOM looks like now. If we come over here, so I undid that change, by the way. So now I am create element app component, not the h1. So if we come in here, we see example 1 div ID application. Then underneath that, we have our mounted application, h1 data react root, which is a attribute that indicates that this is the root point of a React application with the class of header. Notice how it says class here and not class name. Again, that's because class name is the JavaScript property of the element that sets the class. It's important to understand. And then we get our content. And we of course can nest this. So let's say instead of creating an element like that, let's say create element section, class name, site wrap, and then inside of this we'll do React create element, and we'll do an h1 null header, and then we'll do comma React create element, passing in a a p null lorem ipsum, which doesn't autocomplete in JavaScript mode. So now we're creating an actual hierarchy in our application, and a hierarchy of our shadow DOM. And if I come over here, we see that indeed our shadow DOM got merged into the real DOM. Now this might not seem so exciting because we're not changing anything yet. We're not responding to events. We'll do that in the next video. But I just really want to point out what's going on here. And now it's also important to understand is you can have as many React mount points as you want. So let's say if I have this div ID application, let's do application 2, and then let's come over here and copy and paste this and render out app component into the application 2 mount point. If we come over here, we now see we have 2 sections. So you can kind of maybe start to get the idea that React can not only be used for monolithic as single page applications, but it can also be used for minor components inside of your application, where you can mount your React components to any sort of DOM element you want. Now it's important to understand once you do mount that, React now has control. Kind of think about anytime you see data-react root, React has control over those DOM elements. If you start manipulating those DOM elements in certain circumstances and you're not careful, you might start messing around with React's internals, and that won't ever be a fun time. So it's important to understand that. But we'll see many different examples of how we can use the shadow DOM to our advantage here. So I'll just undo that. The last thing I want to do in this video is introduce a tool, because in the next video we'll talk about JSX. But in this video, I want to finish off by looking at a tool, an official tool made by Facebook. It's the React Developer Tools. I don't know if they have React Developer Tools for Firefox. They probably do, but I don't really use Firefox a whole lot. So I would recommend going ahead and downloading the React Developer Tools and adding it to Chrome if you use Chrome. And what that'll do is we can pop back over to our example, and we can find our React, which is right here. By the way, you can reorganize these tabs. I actually found this out like a month ago. I think it's really cool. You can actually drag and drop these tabs. So like if you don't care so much about sources, you can move, you know, that over there and so on. What is application? Is this new? I don't know. Anyway, so the React developer tools, I just want to make sure you guys have them installed. I won't go super in-depth into them, but until we start playing around with tracing the updates and so on. But we can see right here that we have app component, and then inside we see the DOM. And what we can see here is we have on the right-hand side these props. So the section has props, two props, children, and class name. Notice how that's kind of a merging of this object that I passed in, as well as these two additional arguments that I passed into the React create element. So props is short for properties. Every single element on the shadow DOM has properties. And so we're able to look at the shadow DOM's properties on the right-hand side by inspecting this. So we can see the children, and then we open up the children, and now we're actually looking deep into the shadow DOM. This is an actual shadow DOM representation. It has a bunch of weird things like _owner and self and shadow children and store and more props as well. But we're not too worried about the internal representation of the shadow DOM because, again, we're either going to use these helper methods, react.createElement, or we're going to use JSX. And we're going to talk about JSX in the next video. And we'll see you guys then.